All right, so today we're going to be talking about Chapter 5, Section 1, the culture of the mountains and the sea. And I wanted to introduce the chapter since we're going to spend a lot of time on it this week. We're looking at the era of Greek history known as Classical Greece. And this is the time from 2000 BCE up until about 300 BCE. And so during this time, the history and culture of classical Greece has had a significant impact on the world. And so I know we don't always do a whole chapter or spend a lot of time on a subject, but we're going to spend 5 days on this subject because the ancient Greeks have had such a profound effect on who we are. I wanted to show you where we're talking about in the world. And so you can look and you can see the various city-states in Greece, a couple prominent ones worth mentioning. Sparta and Athens, of course, are the two big ones that we'll look at. But you can also look and you can see all these little islands around. I wanted to show you kind of a side profile of Greece, too, because you can see that it's a lot like where we live. You can see the mountains. So look at the topography part in the bottom left corner there, that much of the region is mountainous. I also wanted to show you just kind of a couple of examples of how Greek culture has influenced global culture. So when you see the term Hellenistic, this is kind of the emerging culture of the Middle East, of North Africa, of Europe throughout. So Hellenistic is really a blended culture of many different aspects. So a few things that are uniquely Greek. Their religion, Greek gods and goddesses. Their form of government. In fact, the Athenians were the first to experiment with democracy. Art forms, city-states. But then a few things that you'll see in common between this more global emerging culture when the Roman Empire conquers all of these regions. The Greek language was still the common language used in trade. In fact, the Greek religion is still well known. When I mention today Hercules, you know who I'm talking about. Even though Hercules is a story that's thousands of years old, you still know who I'm talking about. The Greeks still resonate in our culture. If I showed you some of the Greek alphabet, you'll recognize a lot of the symbols because they're still the ones that we use today. In fact, a lot of Greek writings you're familiar with. I'm sure you've heard of Aristotle, perhaps Plato, perhaps Socrates, and even I'm sure you've heard of a lot of the Greek plays. If you haven't heard of Oedipus Rex, it's a Greek tragedy. In fact, the very concept of tragedy, the very concept of theater was developed by the Greeks. So let's get into
Voices from the Past, Chapter 5, Classical Greece, Alexander and Bucephalus.
When King Philip II of Macedonia died in 336 BC, his 20-year-old son, Alexander, became king. In just 13 years, the young man, who came to be known as Alexander the Great, conquered the Persian Empire and ruled a kingdom that stretched from the Mediterranean Sea to India. Alexander was one of the greatest generals the world has ever known, and this exceptional military man rode an exceptional horse into battle. Alexander was only 12 years old when he came to own the horse. The story of Alexander and his horse reveals much about the boy who would grow up to conquer half the ancient world. One day, King Philip and his attendants were trying out a fine-spirited black charger with a white spot on his forehead. Philip wanted to buy the horse, but feared that the animal was untamable. Every time one of his attendants tried to mount the horse, he reared up. Attempts to soothe the horse only made him more excited. Soon King Philip lost patience. "This animal is too wild to let anyone ride him," he told the seller, and he and his attendants began to walk away. But Alexander, who was with his father, had watched the horse's reactions closely. "Let me try," he begged his father. "I know I can handle him." At first, Philip scolded his son, saying, "What makes you think you can tame this horse, when these men who are older and wiser than you could not?" But Alexander continued to insist until finally Philip said, "And if you cannot handle this horse, How will you pay for your foolishness?" "I will pay the whole price of the horse," asserted Alexander. At this, all the men laughed. The horse cost 13 talents, a huge sum for a young boy. But Philip, thinking he would teach his son a lesson, allowed him to approach the horse. Alexander quickly ran to the animal, but didn't try to mount him. Instead, he led him away from the spectators toward the sun. The boy realized that the horse had been frightened by his own shadow. Gently, he stroked the horse and whispered to him until the creature calmed down. Finally, Alexander mounted the horse and rode him, slowly at first, then at full speed. Triumphantly, he galloped back to his father and the others. As the attendants cheered, Philip presented the horse to Alexander and said, "O my son, look thee out a kingdom equal to and worthy of thyself, for Macedonia is too little for thee." Alexander named his horse Bucephalus, meaning ox head, because the horse's head seemed as large as a bull's. Bucephalus carried Alexander on many military campaigns and into many battles. Stories, some true, some mythic, were told about the pair. One true story illustrates Alexander's devotion to his horse. While Alexander was fighting in Persia, Bucephalus was stolen. A tribe of mountain people were guilty of the theft, and Alexander wasted no time in sending them a grim warning. "Return my horse, or I will massacre your entire tribe." So feared was Alexander that Bucephalus was returned immediately. Bucephalus died during a battle in a village in present-day Pakistan. Broken-hearted, Alexander had his warrior companion buried there. In honor of his beloved horse, Alexander named the village Bucephala.
Of the culture of the mountains and the sea. This is chapter 5, section 1. And so we're going to talk about the roots of Greek cultures. It's based on various people groups like the Mycenaeans, the Minoans, and also the Dorians. Now, Greece is a collection of separate lands where the Greek-speaking people live. And so the reason I use the term Greek is because that's the name for their language. In fact, in many cases, that was the only unifying factor with these people. They spoke the same language. In fact, Greece is a collection of about 2,000 different islands. And so if you're Greek, you speak Greek. If not, they called you a barbarian. Now, that's not them calling you a savage. It's literally them referring to the way that your language sounds to them. Yeah, absolutely. It's a phonetic term that if you don't know a person's language, it sounds like gibberish. Now, the sea is extremely important in understanding Greek culture. The Greeks were, the early Greeks, the Minoans and the Phoenicians were the first to begin to travel the Mediterranean. In fact, the Mediterranean is a Greek term for middle of the earth. And guess what? Their archipelago is in the middle of the earth. So they view themselves as the center of their own world, if you will. So a few things important to note about the Greeks. Their land is close to the sea. They have a lack of natural resources. They don't have giant farms like we do in Iowa. They have mountains and islands, but access to the sea. So it's going to encourage global travel and trade. And so I want to show you a map here of just Greek and Phoenician colonies and trade. And so you can see that the western part of the Mediterranean was heavily colonized. There were people speaking Greek in as far as Great Britain. In the Iberian Peninsula, what is today Spain, these folks settled in Gaul, what is today France. They settled in Egypt, in what is today Turkey and Asia Minor. I mean, these folks are all over the place. So how about the land of Greece? Well, this region is mountainous. Travel there occurs slowly. And in fact, these territories were divided into regions. So, like the topography map I showed you earlier, since Greece was so mountainous, like where we're divided by the Blue Ridge Parkway, you don't go to Waynesville unless you really need to go to Waynesville, even though it's geographically not that far away. Since you have to drive up and over a mountain, it makes it more difficult to travel. And if you think about, like some of you guys mentioned travel as a difficulty, rewind a few thousand years when going over the mountains is not a simple affair. It would take days. You're just likely to stay where you are. And something interesting that we've learned in studying world cultures is that when a group of people are together and they are isolated for long enough, they develop their own language. That when two peoples are sundered, even if they speak the same language, after a few generations, they will speak two different languages, and they will not be able to understand one another. Another thing important to understand about the geography is there was a lack of farmland because the territories were mountainous. And so the actual Greek mainlands tend to have larger populations than what they would normally be able to support. They can support these larger populations because of the sea, because of fishing, because of trade. The climate in Greece is beautiful. It's warm. It's a long, warm season conducive to an outdoor type of lifestyle. In fact, the Greek men especially spent much of their time outdoors. A photograph of modern Greece. This is the Galapagos Island, right on the Mediterranean. You see these beautiful whitewashed buildings with a mountainous backdrop. Typical Greek topography. So a little about Greek history. The Mycenaeans were a group of Indo-Europeans. The Indo-Europeans migrated out from Asia throughout the world. They're one of the largest early ethnic groups that migrated and spread all throughout. And so they first came into the Greek mainland in 2000 BCE. They called themselves Mycenaeans, or we call them Mycenaeans as well, because of their largest city-state of Mycenaea. And their culture and their politics were dominated by a monarchy, meaning that a ruling king, would pass down their power to their son unless they're overthrown violently. And they eventually absorbed the culture of the Minoans. The Minoans, who lived on the island of Crete, the largest of the Greek islands, were eventually taken over by the Mycenaeans, who also adopted their policy of going around the Mediterranean world and trading and meeting with everybody. Another Greek story I'm sure you're all familiar with is the story of the Trojan War. It's actually based on a true story. A series of wars were fought between the Greeks, that is the Mycenaeans, and the Trojans in the 1200s BCE. It was once thought to be all made up by this blind poet named Homer, and who wrote the story in his famous epic, the Iliad. And, of course, the sequel, the Odyssey, telling the story of Odysseus, who traveled around, who got lost for 20 years trying to get home after the war. Well, you may know the war, or at least some stories about it. A new movie came out not too long ago starring Brad Pitt and Eric Bana, who played Achilles and Hector, respectively. Now, in the movie, the two civilizations nearly destroyed one another. And, of course, you may have heard the famous story of the Trojan horse. If you haven't, we'll get into it a little bit here. Now, the climax of the story is not actually the Trojan horse, although that's the part that we're most familiar with. It's actually the famous duel between Hector and Achilles. And the way the story goes is that Achilles went to the gates of Troy to personally challenge their great captain Hector to single combat. Hector reluctantly goes out to face his foe. And you see that one of them won here. I don't want to spoil it. You're going to get to see it in just a moment. And that obviously he took the person's head and then rode on a chariot, dragging the body while carrying the head for everyone to see. So this is how you did your victory dance in the ancient Greek world.
Offering to Poseidon. The Greeks are praying for a safe return home. This is a gift. We should take it to the temple of Poseidon.
I think we should burn it. Burn it, my prince. It's a gift to the gods.
Father, burn it. But if there was a Trojan War, it was most likely not the single long engagement of the Homeric epics.
One of the things that makes people wonder, is Homer realistic, is the fact that he says the siege had lasted 10 years. Well, the point is, it's not really a siege. The Greeks aren't encircling Troy with a wall and shooting catapults at it. They're encamped at a safe distance, and they are having a good time making money and seizing women from the surrounding territory. And so they haven't been in any hurry, frankly, to capture Troy because business has been too good.
But eventually, a decisive battle would have to be fought.
The war finally comes to a head when the Greeks no longer can do business. There's no longer anything else for them to seize. And when the Trojans can't afford to wait any longer because they've run out of food and money waiting for the Greeks to move.
Now, we must find out if the battle ends in a stalemate just as Homer says. If so, would the Greeks resort to trickery to win the war? To find the answers to these questions, Unsolved History travels to the U.S. Army's Military Academy at West Point. Here, systems analyst Dr. Paul West, Lieutenant Colonel Theodore Westhusing, and the Academy cadets have programmed a battle simulator to refight the Trojan War. The state-of-the-art technology they are using is known as JCATS, which stands for Joint Conflict and Tactical Simulation. The U.S. military uses this program to plan combat missions around the world.
The big realism that comes into play with simulation is that you can put large masses of units on the ground, on the actual terrain, and test tactics, techniques, and procedures in ways that we couldn't do, or we could do at great cost out in the field.
Before we replay our virtual Trojan War, we must first estimate the number of combatants there are on the battlefield. Homer tells us that a Greek armada of more than 1,000 ships sailed on Troy.
Homer's implying there were 100,000 plus Greek warriors. We were to think of the Trojans and their allies as being 60,000. Archaeology and topography show that this is almost surely an exaggeration. The exaggeration might be as great as a factor of 10.
The latest archaeological evidence does not support the huge numbers Homer suggests. The total population of the fortified citadel and surrounding lower city was probably no greater than 7,000. Our experts estimate that the Greeks had the numeric advantage with 10,000 troops to 6,000 Trojan troops, but the Trojans held a fortified position on the high ground. Using the text and logic, we lay out the most likely battlefield. We place the Greek camp to the south and west of the city at Beshica Bay. the most natural port for ships sailing north toward the Dardanelles. The battlefield therefore runs north and east toward the southwestern wall of Troy. This information is put into the simulator.
Each of these icons that you see actually represents a battalion's worth of soldiers. On this, what we're looking at now, there are 10,000 Greeks encamped there to roughly 6,000 Trojans who were camped across the rise of the plain.
The input that went into this simulation was extraordinary. We began with taking a close look at the Iliad and developing from Homer's text what we would call an execution checklist that lists exactly what Homer says did occur in terms of what task was performed, why it was performed, where it was performed, and at what point in the battle.
Okay, so that's the legend of the ancient Greeks. You know, one of their biggest legends is the story of the Iliad, that is the fall of the great city of Troy. Now, what actually happened to the Mycenaeans? We don't exactly know. We know their civilization collapsed around 1200 BCE. It's possible that it was other migrating groups, a large group called the Dorians who came in, who were kind of a similar ethnic group. They were just a different group of nomadic peoples who moved in. But while we call this the age of the Dorians, it's also a bit of a dark age because we have all of this writing from the Mycenaean period. That's where the story of the Iliad came from. That's where a lot of the details about the early Mycenaean kings came from. But then when the Dorians came in, we have no written records of that time period. The stories that we have that came out of this time period are stories that were told through oral tradition. Homer was one of these famous epic storytellers, and so the great storyteller told of the Iliad, about the Trojan War, and we've seen some of this already, but I've got more coming. So, had to have a Trojan War meme. So anyway, yeah, there's more to come. All right, so the legends tell of the fall of Troy not long after that duel. And, of course, the hero Achilles also perishes in the battle. It was foretold that he would die of a wound to his ankle. And so to keep him safe, his mother dipped him in the river Styx, and that's the river that divides the waking life from the afterlife. And the irony was he was believed to have been invincible, except eventually an arrow struck him in the heel, where his mother dipped him by his heel. That was the only piece that didn't touch the water. Now, here's Zeus. Again, there's temples and statues to these people, and their images have been recreated all over the Greek world.